Is this the 11th century equivalent of the sports car as the extension of male success and virility? I think that's certainly the case. Well-endowed stallion, powerful rider. Is the Bayeux Tapestry the rudest piece of medieval artwork ever made? Well, it does have a remarkable number of, what's a nice way of saying it, male members in it, like this one. In fact, there are 93 of them to be precise. Now, medieval artists weren't afraid of showing what we might consider to be graphic nudity in their work. Think of the shield and the gig that you see on the side of Anglo-Norman churches, for instance. But there's something about the explicit nature of this embroidery that demands explanation. Now, this does mean I'm going to be talking about genitals a bit in this conversation. That's a little bit unsettling, I realise, but bear with me because this is legit history. We're HistoryExtra after all, the channel from BBC History magazine, so this is proper history. Famously, the tapestry tells the story of the Norman Conquest of England in 1066, when the Norman Duke, William the Conqueror, defeated King Harold II of England and claimed the English crown for himself. It's 70 metres long and half a metre high, and it's basically one long embroidered cartoon explaining how Harold took over from the previous king, Edward the Confessor, and how William in turn took over from Harold, and that of course involves one hell of a big fight at the Battle of Hastings. But there's much more to it than that. It's full of secrets and curiosities, and quite a lot of rudeness. That's why it's so much fun to study. In fact, I'm so keen on it that I wrote a book all about it, with this guy. I want to show you some of these mysteries. So here I am, in Reading Museum in England, just west of London, exploring the Bayeux Tapestry. Hang on, yes, I did say Reading. You're probably thinking that the clue is in the name, and you'd be right. The Bayeux Tapestry lives in the historic town of Bayeux in Normandy, and has been there for 600 years at least, barring a couple of little incidents when Napoleon and then the Nazis moved it somewhere else. It's thought by most scholars that the tapestry was made pretty soon after the events it depicts in 1066, probably by English seamstresses in Canterbury in England, before it ended up in Bayeux in Normandy. So why am I in Reading? Because it's got a replica, full size and full scale. It was made in the 19th century and has a great story to tell itself, and quite a Victorian attitude towards obscenity as well. We'd better take a quick look at the tapestry's format before we get to the rude bits. So, we'll start at the beginning. England's king, Edward the Confessor, is talking to two chaps here in the tapestry. One of them must be one of his leading men, Earl Harold Godwinson, who later goes on to become King Harold later in the story. Now, there are a couple of things to note here. Firstly, look at the little caption at the top, Edward Rex, King Edward. So that's all we get by way of introduction. The captions, which are in Latin, are vague like this throughout the whole tapestry. So there's always an enigmatic air about what might be going on. And secondly, let's look at the form of the embroidery. So we have the central panel in the middle, where the cartoon action is, and then these two borders, above and below, where all manner of weirdness happens. Here, we've just got some birds and some mythical looking creatures. As we go along though, there are lots of fantastical and exotic beasts that appear, including some camels at one point. They're often in pairs. What are they doing? Nobody really knows. The tapestry is almost 1,000 years old, and the makers didn't weave any footnotes into their work. But lots of people have spent a lot of time theorising about these strange details. They look like they're just there for decoration at this stage, but later on they sometimes appear to be offering commentary on what's happening in the tapestry, either getting excitable as the action hots up, or looking a little bit uneasy when something bad is happening. On top of that, there are sometimes little mini cartoons in the borders, separate scenes that aren't part of the main story, but which might again be making some sort of critique about the actions of the central characters. We'll see one in just a minute. Anyway, on we go. Earl Harold leaves England and goes off on a sea voyage with his companions, his hunting dogs and his hunting hawks. He's not travelling light, but it looks like something goes wrong on the voyage because he ends up in the hands of a local lord in northern France, Count Guy of Ponthieu, and it's clear that he doesn't want to be there. The text in the tapestry says, "Hic apprehendit Guido Harold," or "Here Guy seizes Harold." He's being roughly handled. I think it always looks a bit like a barroom brawl to me. There's a fair bit of testosterone pumping in the scene, at least that's what I see. But below here, things are getting odd in the border. This is one of these scenes I was talking about. We've got some sort of story being told here, with these fellas with clubs chasing some animals, and some animals behind them maybe being chased as well. So the guy at the rear seems to be looking back at two goats, and behind the goats is a wolf. This is very mysterious. One idea is that this is telling a version of a fable. Aesop's fables, the classical Greek stories that used animals to deliver moral messages, were pretty widely known in medieval Europe. This one might be the fable of the Kid and the Wolf, where a baby goat escapes being eaten by a wolf by distracting it with a song. The underlying lesson being that you shouldn't get distracted when you're trying to do something important, because if you do, like the wolf, you won't get to eat the goat. A bit weird, I agree. It's weirder still if you look at the original tapestry rather than this replica, because in that, the leading club guy has got what I think is prominent and pretty obvious male tackle hanging down below his smock. Whoa. Now, the historian who counted the tapestry penises, and we'll have more on him in a minute, did not include this in his tally. The figure isn't nude, so it's not clear cut, I suppose, and it could be a scabbard for a sword or a dagger. What do you think? Dagger scabbard or dangling manhood? Answers in the comments, please. If it is genitals, then the tapestry count rises from 93 to 94, so this matters, people. Why, you might ask, would this chap have his genitals embroidered for all to see? This is very much the question. We cannot really know, but perhaps because he sits almost directly below Harold in the main frame, it's somehow casting aspersions on Harold's masculinity or his sexual probity. One specific idea is that it's supposed to emphasise the overt masculinity that we can see in the action in the main tapestry narrative. But there are two things that we should take note of here. This replica version that we're looking at doesn't show this potential rudeness because it was stitched by the ladies of the Leek Embroidery Society in the later 19th century under the direction of a certain Mrs. Elizabeth Wardle. The tapestry was made in the 1880s and it toured the world before ending up here in Reading. At the time, as I'm sure you know, there was a certain Victorian reserve, which meant that somebody deemed it wise to tone down the more overt nudity. Though actually, the ladies who stitched it were working off an already censored, hand-coloured set of photographs, so it wasn't the ladies themselves who were reticent about this, it was the photographs that they worked off that were tinkered with, probably by a man. So, if you come to visit the Reading Tapestry, you're going to miss out on the male members that have been tallied up by Oxford professor George Garnett. He's the academic I mentioned earlier. Professor Garnett counted them and then wrote a fascinating article about the priapic predilections, as he said, of the tapestry designer for BBC History magazine a little while ago. And he considered why on earth there are so many knobs on display and what it tells us about the designer and the story being told. As I've said, Professor Garnett got up to 93, but if we included this one, the count goes to 94. And the Victorians clearly thought there was something to worry about here because they expunged the offending items from their version. In the Reading replica, the men's members are missing, replaced by little shorts or simply omitted, and the horses' ones are generally removed too, or scaled down from the more prodigiously sized and enthusiastically stitched ones in the original. So what is going on here? Why so much genitalia? Well, as I've said, medieval folks weren't averse to showing this sort of thing in art, but there does seem to be something specific about the ones we're seeing in the Bayeux Tapestry. Most of the examples on show are equine. The horses' appendages tend to get larger in size according to the status of the rider. So Duke William, for instance, tends to have a mount with a very prominent pecker, as quite often does his adversary Earl Harold. Is this the 11th century equivalent of the sports car as the extension of male success and virility? I think that is certainly the case. Well-endowed stallion, powerful rider. Now the human examples are harder to explain, assuming we need to look beyond some sort of puerile adolescent humour. Let's move on to the more definite male members to think about them a bit more. We'll quickly skip through the narrative to get there. Count Guy captures Harold and takes him to his court. Duke William hears about it and sends men over from Normandy to release him. And here's Guy leading Harold on horseback to go and meet William. But wait 1 second. What's going on down in the border? More nudity. Directly below Harold on his horse, riding behind Guy, is a naked couple, with the man reaching out to what looks like a reluctant woman. And guess what? In the original tapestry, the man has a very obvious member on display, which is missing here in our Reading replica. What is going on? Well, that is very much up for conjecture. Some say it's another fable about a man who raped his daughter, while others reckon that the fact that the border scene is directly below Harold in the main action is supposed to cast some doubt on him personally. Same idea as the way the earlier chap was running below Harold in the border. If it is showing a man raping his daughter, then you can imagine this act of treacherous predation would reflect very negatively on the people in the main panels and be designed to cast them in a very dim light for the audience. Whatever we're supposed to make of that, Harold soon ends up in William's hands as a seemingly unwilling guest of a rival claimant to the throne of England. William, on his well-endowed horse, takes Harold to his court in Rouen. At least the horse is well endowed in the original tapestry, but in the replica here, it's barely noticeable. But then we get to the biggest mystery of all in the tapestry, which again has an air of obscenity to it. This scene is captioned Ubi unus clericus et elfgifer, which translates as where a cleric and elfgifer. It's kind of missing a verb, but that's only really the half of it. It doesn't appear to have anything to do with the main story that's being told in the rest of the tapestry, but something very important is clearly happening here. We've got a woman levitating inside some sort of fantastical pillared structure, with a churchman either slapping or caressing her face from outside. Underneath in the border, shortly before this, is a naked man, bending over, doing some carpentry in the nude, which is kind of dangerous. Don't do that at home. Now, this might be linked to another fable of a man who persuaded some trees to provide him wood for a handle for his axe, which he then proceeded to use to chop the trees down. Why he's naked is anyone's guess. And anyway, that looks more like an adze than an axe. And then, underneath the floating woman, there is another naked man, this time mimicking the outstretched position of the churchman in the main scene. In our replica, the Victorians have put little shorts on the chap so his little fella isn't dangling down quite so ostentatiously as it does in the original. It's fair to say that in the original tapestry he is proudly displaying his wares. There are so many theories about what this Elfgiver episode is that we need an entirely new video to explore them all. For our purposes though, it's important to note that there are hardly any women shown in the tapestry at all. It's very much a man's world. So this scene really stopped you in its tracks because of that. It also seems beyond doubt that the second naked man in the border is linked to the churchman in the main scene, given the similarity of their pose. It's hard to ignore his very obvious erection in the original tapestry, so that must be something that the audience is supposed to take note of. This has led modern historians to observe that this might be referencing some sort of sexual scandal, a medieval Me Too moment perhaps. Everyone at the time would presumably have known about it. It's so obvious that it's hard to believe that the original tapestry viewers weren't supposed to know what this was telling them. Now, the details of that scandal are lost to us, but the echo remains in the embroidered erection. Anyway, we're going to rush on through the second half of the tapestry, past the bit where Harold possibly purges himself by making an oath of loyalty or support to William, past the death of King Edward and his burial at Westminster, past Harold's coronation and the mysterious and doom-laden appearance of a comet in the sky, past William's anger at hearing the news of Harold's coronation, his fleet building and his invasion, and on to the readying for the Battle of Hastings. So, let's pause here and look at the mounted Norman knights getting ready for action. They look pretty fearsome on their steeds, but above them in the border, guess what? Naked people. Two sets of naked couples, in fact. One where a guy with an axe is offering a bag to a woman, and he has very prominent testicles in the original tapestry, though the axe obscures his actual member. And another where a naked man and woman are rushing towards each other. Why? What has this got to do with the looming battle? Again, these might be linked to fables, specifically stories about illicit sex, treachery and betrayal. Perhaps they talk to Harold's perceived betrayal himself in taking the crown when he'd made that oath to William, or at least that's the Norman version of events. If it seemed odd to you that there are these curious vignettes of obscenity abutting the coming violence of battle, I guess we need to talk about the audience here. chances are that the people who are expected to see this tapestry were military men, and these could have been bawdy in-jokes that they would have appreciated. Maybe they elicited knowing smirks and ribald remarks. Maybe they allowed for little moments of mirth amidst the gore. Were they laughing at the knob gags and appreciating the blood and guts? Or were they taking moral messages from the fables? Or were they doing all these things? Or maybe it's much more complicated than that. One theory has it that the whole tapestry was made for a monastic audience, with a general tone of moralising against the secular sins of the worldly and power-hungry. Maybe the graphic nudity is actually to embarrass and belittle the likes of both Harold and William in this story. The very fact that there are these nude scenes and horse appendages does give us a bit of an insight into the mind of the man, and we assume it was a man who masterminded the production of the tapestry. The most likely candidate for that is Odo of Bayeux, Duke William's half-brother. Anyway, from here to the end of the tapestry, it's pretty much all death and gore now as we gear up to the bloody mess of the Battle of Hastings. So a lot of people know that the Bayeux Tapestry shows the Battle of Hastings, and that's true, but actually it's only the last third of it. The first 2/3 of the tapestry are all about the run-up. Here's the bit where Harold dies on the field with an arrow in the eye. Although there is considerable debate about whether the tapestry originally showed this particular ocular injury. It seems it was actually the result of restoration efforts carried out in the 19th century. We do get some more nudity at the finish of the tapestry, but that is very gratuitous, in the form of dead corpses of fallen soldiers being relieved of their armour and left naked on the battlefield. It's not exactly obscene, but it's certainly not very nice. Anyway, there's always more to see, but I'm skipping along because I want to get to the final mystery, the end. And the end here in this replica is much neater than the original in Bayeux, which is very ragged and full of holes at this point, the result of being regularly wound and unwound on a reel for 19th century visitors. In both versions though, it definitely tails off. This is not how the tapestry was intended to conclude in the 11th century. Now, whether it was never actually finished or it's lost its final scenes in the last few centuries, that is impossible to say, as is what was actually supposed to be shown here. We've got the last of the English army fleeing the scene in disarray at the end of the tapestry here, chased by the victorious Normans. Most scholars reckon that the last scene that would have followed this would have been showing the coronation of William the Conqueror at Westminster Abbey. That would have added some nice symmetry to having Edward the Confessor at the start, and it would have been very important for reminding the audience who the real winner in the story is: William. Would there have been more nudity in the last panel? Probably not. And there certainly isn't in the reimagining of what it might have looked like here, because Handley, just round the corner, is something that was made earlier. A few years ago, the artist Jan Messent stitched together a possible final panel. And here we can see it. It shows William being crowned in Westminster. She's not the only person to have done this. And in fact, right now in France, Hélène Delpré is making another one in time for the millennial commemorations of the birth of William the Conqueror in the year 2028. Look out for that. But in the meantime, do come to Reading if you can to see this Victorian replica. And of course, get over to Normandy to visit the tapestry in its home in Bayeux. Either way, make sure you're ready for the X-rated content.